Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? My name is Muriel Rouillet. I'm a adjunct professor of political science, public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And on behalf of the study group on contemporary Europe here at the Center for European Studies, I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending this public address on the current state of France and Europe, given by His Excellency Mr. Jean-Marc Ayrault, former Prime Minister of France. This address will be followed by a commentary by Michael Ignatieff, Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice at the Harvard Kennedy School. And, excuse me, it will be preceded by preliminary remarks by the Consul General of France, Mr. Fabien Fieschi, who is sitting here and will come to the podium then. Before introducing our event today, let me express our gratitude to the people and institutions that have made it possible. The French Embassy in the United States, the Consulate General of France in Boston, and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. This list would not be complete if I did not mention the work of people here at the CS, who, thanks to their passion and interest, their intellectual curiosity, make Europe and its nations alive in our minds and hearts here at Harvard. Well, France is one of those nations. It was recently in the public eye as the country is under heavy pressure from its European partners to reform its social model and reduce its long-standing budget deficit. At the same time, many citizens in France, and this includes some distinguished economists, doubt that the country will achieve sustainable growth by following an austerity program increasingly criticized, in Germany too, for being a one-size-fits-all policy. Our guests will discuss the politics of reform in France, where social change has traditionally come about through crisis or revolution, in a specific European context, where markets, politics, and public opinion interact on a transnational and increasingly global scale. Let me first turn to our first guest of honor, His Excellency Monsieur Jean-Marc Ayrault. Mr. Ayrault, you are and have been a socialist member of the French Parliament since 1986. You served as Prime Minister of France from May 2012 until March 2014. And you were previously mayor of Nantes for more than 20 years, between 1989 and 2012. You came to politics in your 20s, and you've held political mandates continuously since then, while for part of that time pursuing a career as a teacher of German. President of the socialist group in the French Parliament between 1997 and 2012, you earned a reputation for your conciliatory skills. And as the mayor of Nantes, you earned your city the top of the New York Times rankings for quality of life, and you won the European Green Capitals Award in 2013, which rewarded Nantes' good practices in sustainable development and attracted national and international attention for making your city a model of participatory democracy à la française. Following François Hollande's victory in the 2012 presidential election, you were appointed Prime Minister of France, symbolizing a certain idea of social democratic reformism and Franco-German friendship. You resigned as Prime Minister on March 31st of this year, after the electoral defeat of the Socialist Party in the national-wide municipal election. Let me now turn to our distinguished commentator, Professor Michael Ignatieff. Currently, Edward R. Murrow, Professor of Practice at the Harvard Kennedy School, but also a renowned writer and a former politician, Michael Ignatieff is a man of many lives and talents, a truly cosmopolitan public intellectual whose life has taken him on both sides of the Atlantic and engaged him in various aspects of human affairs. Professor Ignatieff, you are Canadian, which is why you speak an excellent French, but I'm sorry, I'm going to deprive the audience of this because I'm going to kindly request everybody to speak English when possible to shorten the translation time today. And I apologize for our French guests, but this is for fluidity of debate. So, Professor Ignatieff, you hold a doctorate in history from Harvard University. You held academic posts in Europe at King's College in Cambridge, UK, and in North America at the University of Toronto and the University of British Columbia prior to this appointment you have at the Kennedy School. You also served in the Parliament of Canada and were a leader of the Canadian Liberal Party. Your many books include different genres, novels, essays, biography, memoirs, covering a wide range of political matters, from the war in former Yugoslavia or human rights, to the life and thought of Isaiah Berlin, and most recently, a profound reflection on success and failure in politics, with your recent book, Fire and Ashes, Success and Failure in Politics, published in 2013. All those books have in common a deep humanistic concern for the human political condition across borders. So you are the perfect commentator for Mr. Ayrault's address. And once again, Mr. Ayrault, Mr. Ignatieff, we are deeply honored and happy of your presence here. We value your insights and experience. And it is now time for me to leave the floor to the Consul General of France, Mr. Fabien Fieschi, whom I thank again for being here, for his support, and who will deliver a few introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Une phrase en français,
Yeah,
s'il vous plaît. Donc, Monsieur le Premier ministre, chers amis, c'est pour moi un honneur et un plaisir de participer à l'ouverture de cette conférence de Monsieur Jean-Marc Ayrault au Centre pour les études européennes de l'Université de Harvard. And it's truly a great privilege to be back at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University to say just a few words as an introduction to the address by the former Prime Minister of France, Mr. Jean-Marc Ayrault. I want to thank the Center for European Studies for welcoming us tonight, as well as the Kennedy School of Government and its distinguished professor, Muriel Royer, for taking the initiative of this invitation. So, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, you are in a very special place. Not only has Harvard University become a synonym for academic excellence all over the world, but the Center for European Studies plays a very special role in this country, far beyond the campus of Harvard University, in promoting a better understanding of Europe. And beyond the historical bonds that exist between the United States and Europe, bonds that we know well at the French consulate, as this consulate in Boston has opened in 1779, a good understanding of each other on both sides of the Atlantic still matters. Even with the new issues rightfully drawing an increasing share of our attention, such as the rise of China and emerging countries, the situation in the Arab world, the dynamic growth and the security challenges in Africa, you only need to look at the figures of GDP, of trade, of public development aid and military alliances to understand that the relationship between Europe and the United States still matters not only to each of us, but also to the rest of the world. To take the example of France, and even if it's probably too early to ask the academia for a more informed evaluation, the diplomats' assessment is that under President François Hollande and your government's leadership, our bilateral relation with the United States has reached a new high. For the past 2 years, we have witnessed a great convergence of views, both on the matters of international security, how to react to the spread of terrorist organizations to new regions of the world, or to the threats to the security of the Middle East or even Europe, and of economic policy, how to learn the lessons of the 2008 financial crisis while implementing a growth strategy. But I would not hide the fact that I also hear a lot of concerns on this side of the Atlantic and in this region about the current situation of European countries, including France, and of the European Union, the effect of persistently high unemployment rates on the economy, but also on the youth and society, the phenomenon of the homegrown jihadists, the rise of political parties with an extreme and/or anti-EU agenda, or the relation between the European Union and its largest neighbor, Russia. So, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, it is indeed very timely to have the chance to listen to you in this very special place and to have international students and professors benefit from your insights on the current state of France and Europe. Bienvenue à Harvard et merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. So the address will be paused for translation purposes, okay. And it overall should last about 40 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Monsieur le Consul général de France, merci de votre accueil et des mots que vous venez de prononcer. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed for me a true honor and a real pleasure to speak to you today here at Harvard University. I would like, first of all, it's not necessary to translate. If you want to. After. Later. I would like, first of all, to thank the Minda de Gersburg Center for European Studies for the invitation, and in particular, express my gratitude to Professor Muriel Rouillet for granting me this opportunity. I would also like to extend my thanks to Professor Michael Ignatieff, who so warmly accepted to provide me with advice on the comments I shall make. Speaking here today in such a prestigious university about France and Europe is indeed a very special moment for me. You are perhaps not aware of the fact that before being elected mayor, which was a moment that marked the beginning of my political career, I was in fact a teacher, yes, a teacher, for several years. Unfortunately, and you certainly can hear it today, I was not a teacher of English, but of German. So I ask for your indulgence and beg to continue in French. Donc, maintenant, you can help me, Mr. Interpreter. Vous m'avez donc invité à parler de l'avenir de la France et de l'Europe. La question, où en sommes-nous?
So you invited me to talk about the future of France and Europe, and the question I'm asking is, what is the current situation?
Eh bien, nous subissons toujours, en France, mais pas seulement en France, en Europe, les effets de la crise économique qui a suivi la crise financière de 2008. Avec, Monsieur le Consul, vous l'avez rappelé, la persistance d'un chômage de masse qui concerne la plupart des pays d'Europe, pas tous, heureusement, avec des difficultés spécifiques à certains pays, la dette publique et privée élevée, des problèmes de compétitivité pour les entreprises, mais nous assistons aussi, notamment dans la zone euro, à des compétitions fiscales et sociales, et puis le partenariat franco-allemand, qui est le moteur de l'Europe, est aujourd'hui, non pas en panne, mais peine à jouer pleinement son rôle.
France and Europe are still affected today by the consequences of the economic financial crisis of 2008. There is still mass unemployment, and there are difficulties that specific countries encounter, especially a high public and private debt, decrease of competitivity of local companies, and also fiscal and social competition within the single European market, including in the Eurozone. In addition, the French-German partnership, which had been the engine of growth in the construction of Europe, is starting to seem much less dynamic than before.
Cette situation a une conséquence, c'est que le doute s'installe dans les esprits sur l'avenir même du projet européen. Et le vote en faveur des partis populistes, nationalistes et xénophobes progresse dans la plupart des pays, dont la France, avec le parti qui s'appelle le Front National, et qui s'est très fortement exprimé lors des dernières élections au Parlement européen, c'est-à-dire en mai dernier.
The consequence of this situation is that many people are now questioning the future of Europe. And the vote of the electorates in a number of European countries, including in France, in favor of populist, nationalist, and even xenophobe parties, including in France with a party called Front National, has been very strong, and we have noticed that during the latest elections, which were elections of members of the European Parliament.
Et pourtant, malgré cette description un peu pessimiste, plus de 60 ans après la déclaration de Robert Schuman, ministre français des Affaires étrangères, appelant à créer la première communauté européenne entre la France, l'Allemagne, l'Italie, la Belgique, les Pays-Bas et le Luxembourg, la communauté européenne du charbon et de l'acier, près de 60 ans après la signature du traité de Rome, qui a institué le marché commun, la communauté économique européenne, 100 ans après le début de la Première Guerre mondiale, 70 ans après le débarquement allié en Normandie, mettant fin à la Seconde Guerre mondiale, 25 ans après la chute du mur de Berlin et la fin de l'Union soviétique, que de chemin parcouru.
And yet, if we look back, more than 60 years after the call by Robert Schuman, who was the French foreign minister, who promoted the creation of a European community of coal and steel among France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Almost 60 years after the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which instituted the European Economic Community, 100 years after the start of World War I, 70 years after the Allied landing in Normandy, which was going to put an end to World War II, 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can only see that so much has been accomplished.
En effet, l'Europe a dépassé ces conflits meurtriers. Et le XXe siècle a été la pire des tragédies. Et l'Allemagne a réussi courageusement à construire une solide démocratie et aussi réussi, ce qui n'était pas évident, sa réunification, tout en réaffirmant son ancrage à l'Europe. L'Europe s'est unifiée dans un espace de paix et de coopération qui n'a aucun équivalent au monde, compte tenu de son histoire. Ses détracteurs soulignent souvent sa faiblesse politique. Mais quelle entité internationale attire autant les peuples, incite autant les vocations d'adhésion?
Europe has managed to overcome its deadly wars, World War II being the most tragic, of course. Germany managed to build a solid democracy and also succeeded in reuniting East and West of the country, while confirming that it was still an integral part of Europe. Europe is now unified on a continent where peace and cooperation prevail, and there is no equivalent organization in the world. Of course, critics point at the weakness of Europe as a political entity, but no other political organization, multilateral organization, attracts so much peoples and nations and plays such the role of a strong magnet to promote more people joining and more nations joining.
Dans le nouveau contexte mondial, le leadership américain souvent indispose. Les puissances émergentes, elles fascinent à la fois comme elles inquiètent. Et l'Union européenne, malgré les questions qu'elle pose, qu'elle provoque, est devenue une référence. Et j'ai pu, dans mes différents déplacements comme Premier ministre dans le monde, que ce soit en Amérique latine ou même en Asie, où on cherche à construire de nouvelles organisations, l'Europe est souvent perçue comme une expérience et une référence utile et intéressante.
In this new world situation, the US leadership is disliked. And emerging powers fascinate but also worry us. So the European Union has become an anchor of stability and a reference, not only in Europe but in Asia and Latin America, where I went as Prime Minister, and I noticed the interest of countries on those continents for the European construction.
On peut le dire, mais sans aucune hésitation, l'Europe a réussi. L'Europe a réussi ce long parcours, et la France y a joué un rôle déterminant, en particulier dans un partenariat confiant et solide avec l'Allemagne.
I can say that Europe has succeeded, and France has played a major role in this success, especially within a framework of its partnership with Germany.
Après l'effondrement de l'Union soviétique, les deux pays, l'Allemagne et la France, avec le chancelier Helmut Kohl, le président français François Mitterrand, ont su décider de l'essentiel. Lorsque il a fallu choisir, après la chute du mur de Berlin et l'effondrement de l'Union soviétique, ils ont choisi et ils ont agi pour entraîner la stabilité des frontières. La stabilité des frontières, en particulier entre l'Allemagne et la Pologne. Il y a eu aussi, après la création de l'acte unique qui a instauré le marché commun européen, avec Jacques Delors, qui était un très grand président de la Commission européenne, il y a eu la création de l'euro à la même époque, l'installation d'une banque centrale européenne et la réunification de l'Europe, divisée par plus de 40 années de domination soviétique. Et aujourd'hui, l'Europe comprend 28 membres.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, France and Germany, under the leadership of François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, managed to make these decisions on the essential issues. And the primary issue was stability of borders, especially between Germany and Poland. Then, under the impulsion of Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission, the single act created the foundation for the development of Europe as an institution. Then the euro was created to replace local currencies. and Europe was reunified, and now Europe has 28 member states.
Alors la question est vraiment une question importante. Ce n'est pas parce qu'il y a des difficultés et des doutes aujourd'hui que nous allons renier et abandonner cet héritage. Nous ne pouvons pas prendre la responsabilité de laisser démolir cette intuition géniale qu'un grand ensemble serait mieux armé pour faire face à l'avènement des États-continents et à la globalisation du monde que des nations éparpillées. C'est ça le choix de l'Europe. C'est à la fois le choix de la paix, mais c'est aussi le choix de l'avenir.
The question now is, we are confronted with difficulties and doubts, but are these temporary problems enough to convince us to abandon our heritage? Are we going to allow this intuition that multilateral organization would be better equipped to confront current changes, especially the rise of large states spanning a continent in some cases, and also a new situation associated with globalization? Are we allowed the demise of this intuition and go back to small isolated states?
Bon, c'est vrai que la crise financière a ébranlé cette conviction. Mais elle a aussi mis en lumière les malfaçons de la construction de la zone euro, de la zone euro dès l'origine. Mais même si l'Europe a hésité et tardé à réagir au moment de la crise financière, l'euro a été notre paratonnerre. Il a forcé l'Europe à trouver des solutions, des réponses collectives qui l'ont sauvée d'une faillite en chaîne. Et si ça n'avait pas été le cas, nous aurions eu alors une guerre économique intérieure. Et on a vu ce que, dans l'histoire, et en particulier dans les années 30, l'incapacité des gouvernements à l'époque à décider à quoi cela a conduit. Mais si je vous dis ça, c'est parce que nous n'étions pas à l'abri d'un effondrement de l'euro. Et dans un de mes premiers déplacements en tant que Premier ministre, c'était en octobre 2012, j'étais en Asie, Singapour, Philippines, et là, on m'interrogeait dans des universités, comme ici, est-ce que l'euro va disparaître? Eh bien, les Européens, malgré le retard, ont décidé de sauver ce qu'ils avaient décidé de construire. Mais ce sauvetage ne suffit pas. C'est ce dont nous allons parler ensuite.
It is true that this financial crisis has shaken this conviction and shed light on all the problems of the construction of the Eurozone. And even if Europe hesitated and reacted only belatedly to the financial crisis, the euro became our lightning arrestor. It forced Europe to look for collective solutions and responses, and that preserved and protected Europe against many bankruptcies, and also a domestic economic war, like what happened in the 1930s, and we saw the dreadful consequences of that economic war in the 1930s. We wouldn't want the same to happen. We wanted to prevent the collapse of the euro. And as a prime minister, when I was traveling in Asia, Singapore and other places, I was repeatedly asked whether the euro would survive.
Pourtant, quelles que soient les difficultés spécifiques de chaque nation, la France a les siennes propres, et j'y reviendrai tout à l'heure. Dans un monde en profonde mutation, avec ses nouveaux risques, mais aussi ses nouvelles potentialités, un retour en arrière, un repli national, serait une grave faute contre les peuples européens. Pour l'avenir, je le disais, puisqu'il s'agit de construire l'avenir, la France, c'est moins de 1% de la population mondiale. Il est donc plus qu'urgent d'agir, d'approfondir la construction de l'Europe et d'abord de la zone euro et de décider maintenant.
However, regardless of the political and specific difficulties faced by every nation in Europe, and France, I must admit, has problems and must address them. But the world is changing fast, and there are new risks, and also new opportunities that come with the risk. But do we want to go back to the concept of nation state? Do we want to go back to the past? Like, for instance, some countries are tempted to do, like Great Britain, for instance. But I think it would be a serious mistake, and the European peoples would suffer if we chose that path. We have to remember that France only has 1% of the world population. So it is extremely urgent to act fast, and to strengthen the construction of Europe, and before all, of the Eurozone.
Je ne voudrais pas dresser un tableau trop négatif, et je voudrais pour cela souligner les progrès qui ont été accomplis depuis 2008, depuis la crise financière. Et ils sont nombreux. D'abord, de façon pragmatique, la Banque centrale européenne a fait évoluer son rôle et a joué dans cette crise un rôle déterminant. Après la crise grecque, un mécanisme de stabilité, un mécanisme européen de stabilité a été mis en place. Le traité budgétaire, de solidarité budgétaire pour la stabilité, et la coordination et la gouvernance dans la zone euro a été également ratifié et est en œuvre depuis le 1er janvier 2013. L'union bancaire, avec la supervision de toutes les banques par la Banque centrale européenne, est également effective depuis le 1er janvier 2013. L'accord du 29 octobre dernier, qui est un accord multilatéral qui va au-delà de l'Europe, pour l'échange de données entre les banques et les États, permet d'avancer très fortement dans la lutte contre la fraude fiscale. L'accord qui est également intervenu il y a quelques semaines entre les membres de l'Union européenne pour des objectifs contraignants contre le réchauffement climatique va permettre de créer les conditions d'un accord lors de la conférence climat la COP 21 de 2015 à Paris. Et je me réjouis d'ailleurs que les gouvernements chinois, enfin les présidents chinois et américains aient pris il y a quelques jours une décision dans ce sens. Une taxe, même timide, il faut le dire, entre 11 pays sur les transactions financières a également été décidée, et même si là aussi le rôle de l'Union européenne est insuffisant, l'Union européenne a quand même pesé pour qu'un accord soit conclu pour permettre l'approvisionnement en gaz russe de l'Ukraine. Mais malgré ces réels progrès, c'est vrai que le projet européen, l'ambition européenne semble en panne. La croissance continue d'être très faible, pour ne pas dire zéro. Le risque de déflation menace, et la solidarité des pays de la zone euro vis-à-vis des marchés financiers est sans cesse repoussée. Voilà donc ce qui caractérise aujourd'hui l'Europe, des avancées, mais aussi des difficultés. Et pour terminer dans ces difficultés, je citerai le dumping fiscal, qui est toujours pratiqué par certains pays, y compris dans la zone euro, où on a actuellement révélé par la presse une situation inacceptable avec la situation du Luxembourg, mais qui n'est pas seulement du Luxembourg, c'est celle dont on parle, que certains ont même appelé le LuxLeaks. C'est grave, mais c'est grave aussi pour le président de la Commission européenne, qui doit faire face à ces critiques. Et puis c'est aussi un processus de décision politique lent, peu lisible, et qui révèle une crise de gouvernance et une insuffisance démocratique. Et crise démocratique qui a atteint son paroxysme par le non français et néerlandais à l'occasion d'un référendum sur l'avenir des institutions européennes en 2005, qui a provoqué un choc. Cela aurait dû servir d'alerte, mais les conclusions n'ont pas été totalement tirées. Et donc depuis, je suis un petit peu plus long, pardon, monsieur l'interprète, monsieur Schuster, la défiance s'est aggravée et le doute sur l'avenir de l'Europe s'est installé, mais pas seulement entre les peuples européens, dans les opinions publiques européennes, mais à l'échelle mondiale. Est-ce que l'ambition européenne est toujours d'actualité?
Considerable progress have been made after the 2008 financial crisis. I don't want to sound too negative, but I want to mention the positive steps. The Central European Bank the role of the Central European Bank has been strengthened. The European Stability Mechanism has been implemented after the crisis in Greece. The Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance, which is basically a budget agreement, has been ratified and has been in effect since January 1st, 2013. On January 1st, 2013, too, a banking union has been put in place, and now the Central European Bank is able to supervise banks in Europe much better than before. On October 29th, 2014, a multilateral agreement was signed to promote data exchange and also to fight tax fraud. The members of the European Union have agreed on binding objectives against global warming, which enable them to create a foundation for a possible agreement during a conference that will take place in 2015 in Paris, COP21, about the fight against global warming. And I've been very happy to hear recently that the President of China and the US are now promoting the same idea. 11 European countries have implemented a tax, very limited tax, but better than nothing, on financial transactions. I hope we could go farther along, but maybe it will come in the future. The European Union has also played a part, not a major part, but still a significant part, to reach an agreement securing the delivery of gas from Russia to the Ukraine. And that is positive. But in spite of this progress, the European project seems to have broken down, or at least be on hold. There is stagnation on the economic level. There is a strong risk, serious risk of deflation. The solidarity of the countries of the Eurozone on the financial markets is always postponed to a later date. And which is worse, there is still tax dumping being practiced by certain countries, including inside the Eurozone. And this has been revealed especially by the investigation of the international media about what's happening in Luxembourg. Finally, the process of political decision is slow and it lacks transparency. It reveals a crisis in governance and also the inadequate operation of the democratic process. And this democratic crisis has been manifested especially in 2005 by the choice of the French and Dutch electors who rejected the referendum on the constitutional treaty. That should have been an alarm signal, but we ignored it, unfortunately. So mistrust has increased both inside and outside Europe about the future of Europe.
Oui, je vais raccourcir un peu parce qu'avec la traduction, c'est un peu trop long. Je m'excuse. Si vous nous laissez un peu de temps pour échanger. Donc, je vais dire un mot sur la France. La France est engagée dans un processus de réforme depuis 2012 et elle doit les mener jusqu'au bout. Et ces réformes, elle les décide pour elle-même, par elle-même, parce qu'elles sont indispensables en tant que telles. Alors, c'est la réduction des déficits publics, la part des dépenses publiques dans la richesse nationale, non pas en soi, mais pour retrouver des marges de manœuvre, pour investir dans les investissements d'avenir, dans les domaines de la transition énergétique, de l'éducation, de la santé, des infrastructures, de déplacement durable, de l'enseignement supérieur, de la recherche. C'est ce que nous avons engagé à travers une réforme du marché du travail, avec le renforcement du dialogue social, la réforme de notre système éducatif et de formation professionnelle. Un effort sans précédent est engagé pour améliorer la compétitivité de nos entreprises. Le chantier de la réforme de l'État et des administrations locales est en cours. Une réforme des retraites a été adoptée. Notre système de soins doit faire l'objet également d'une restructuration complète, et ce chantier est engagé également. Et puis, un plan de réduction des inégalités, de lutte contre la pauvreté et des inégalités sociales et territoriales est également engagé. Mais toutes ces réformes, et c'est là la difficulté qui fait que l'opinion publique peut douter de l'efficacité des choix politiques qui sont faits, c'est qu'elles demandent du temps pour produire leurs effets. Et je demande qu'on comprenne bien cela pour comprendre ce qui est conduit actuellement en France. On dit souvent l'Allemagne a su se réformer. Mais combien de temps l'Allemagne a-t-elle mis pour se réformer? 10 ans. Est-ce que c'est plus difficile de réformer en France qu'ailleurs? Moi, j'ai fait voter une réforme des retraites. J'ai mis moins de temps que le président Obama pour faire voter sa réforme du financement d'un système d'assurance sociale. Donc vous voyez qu'il faut toujours relativiser. Mais ce qui est sûr, c'est que le chantier est engagé, il demandera du temps, mais il faut aussi de la persévérance et de la constance.
Now, I want to talk more specifically about France, and I know many people tend to blame Europe for all our trouble. We have to admit that there are issues that France must address and resolve on its own. France has started major reforms in 2012, and these reforms are continuing today. They have to succeed. Among the changes we have been implementing is a reduction of public deficit and also the share of public spending in the gross domestic product. We have to find margins of maneuver to enable us to finance investment in a long run for instance, energy transition. We have to finance education, the healthcare system. We need to create durable transportation infrastructures, and also we need to fund higher education and research. We voted a reform of the labor market after negotiations and a strengthening of the social dialogue. We are also in the process of reforming our education system and also the vocational training system. We have launched an unprecedented effort to try to improve competitivity of French companies. We're also reforming the state and government, both on a national level and at the level of local governments. We also are working on reforming pension system, and also the healthcare system as a whole. Finally, we have engaged in a program of reduction of social and territorial inequalities, and also a fight against poverty. Now, all these reforms take time. How much time do we need? I don't know. Germany has embarked on a similar program of reform, and it has taken them 10 years. Does France need more time or less time? I don't know. But what I know is, I was mentioning pension reform. I was able to have a new law voted about pension reform, and it took me less time than President Obama with his healthcare system reform. So there is hope, but we have to be patient.
En tout cas, l'enjeu pour la France, c'est de réussir à retrouver son rôle leader en Europe, tout en préservant son originalité, ce qui fait son modèle social, son modèle républicain, à condition de le réformer profondément. Le cap des réformes est donc fixé, il faut s'y tenir, mais en même temps, il faut que l'Europe change. Donc il ne s'agit pas de demander à l'Europe de changer pour que la France change. La France fera ce qu'elle a à faire, mais l'Europe doit changer. Et ce qui manque à l'Europe, c'est cette nouvelle ambition. Et je vais y revenir en conclusion avec un certain nombre de propositions.
The stake for France is to be able to find again its role of leader in Europe, but at the same time while preserving what makes it an original country. It has to preserve its social and republican model. Of course, it has to be reformed in depth, but still the values must remain. We know the goal, we have set the goal, we know the direction of the reforms. We have to move forward and not lose track of where we want to go. But Europe has to change too. France must succeed in reforming itself, but Europe has to change also, because otherwise there would not be a viable Europe without France.
Voilà, donc on me presse de conclure, donc je vais conclure et ne donnerai pas tous les détails des propositions que je fais pour l'avenir de l'Europe.
Well, I've been asked to go faster, so I will not give you all the details about my proposal for the future.
En tout cas, mais j'y reviendrai si vous le souhaitez.
But if you want, you can ask questions, and I will talk.
En tout cas, ce que je propose pour résumer, c'est que l'Europe est une Europe à 28. Mais l'Europe de la zone euro, c'est 18 pays. Et ces 18 pays doivent engager une intégration plus poussée de leur politique. Ce qui veut dire des choix politiques courageux, qui veut dire peut-être une partie d'abandon de souveraineté pour mettre en commun. Je pense notamment à la fiscalité des entreprises, éviter le dumping social, toute une série de mesures qui permettent d'avancer ensemble, un programme d'investissement sur les investissements d'avenir. En tout cas, il y a urgence à sortir d'un certain dogmatisme. Zéro déficit, ce n'est pas une politique. Ce n'est pas un objectif en soi. J'ai dit qu'il fallait réduire les déficits, mais il faut aussi redonner de la marge, redonner de l'air et refaire de la zone euro une zone de prospérité et de croissance. C'est une question vitale pour les peuples européens en termes d'emploi, en termes de niveau de vie, en termes de fonctionnement des services publics, mais aussi en termes d'attractivité mondiale, de rôle moteur de la zone euro et de l'Europe dans l'économie mondiale. Donc c'est ce qu'il faut faire maintenant. Et il appartient aux dirigeants européens, et en particulier aux dirigeants français et allemands, d'avancer ensemble. Non pas en se lançant des anathèmes, mais en regardant la situation telle qu'elle est pour en sortir concrètement et faire en sorte que dans le contexte multilatéral d'aujourd'hui, l'Europe puisse jouer pleinement son rôle.
Europe has 28 member states, but the Eurozone only has 18 members, and this is where the thrust must exist. We must change things by promoting more integration of these 18 members of the Eurozone. I mentioned some of the programs we embarked on: fight against fiscal and social dumping, reform of the taxation system, increasing the competitivity of companies. We must accept a reduction of sovereignty to a certain extent to make success possible. And the French and German government must be at the forefront again of this movement. They should not disappoint the European countries and the population of Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'm going to give the floor, without further ado, to Professor Ignatieff, and then to the audience for questions and answers.
Well, first of all, I think we heard a first, and I think I've never heard a politician shorten a speech that he had, so bravo to the Prime Minister. Secondly, I am extremely unhappy that I can't show off and display my fabulous French, but my colleague has forbidden it, so je veux vous accueillir ici, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. C'est un grand plaisir et un honneur pour moi. There, I did it. I don't care which one. So,
You did your quota.
I wanted to. I hope I will not use all my time, and I've got my watch out because I want to make sure we have time for the audience. But I wanted to address you not as an homme d'etat, but as an homme politique. That is, address the issue of being a socialist politician in the middle of the most serious economic crisis since the 30s, because that was your fate. The simple story is that French socialism failed to confront the crisis adequately, and that's enormously important for Europe because it leaves a space for populist, authoritarian parties of the right, and it also creates a political space for the center-right in France. So I wanted you to reflect, if you could, about the proposition that French socialism, by which I mean moderate social democracy of the kind that you preached all your life from Mitterrand forward, failed to deal with the deep crisis that France faces, and that gives you an enormous political problem going forward to the next election. And it's much broader than personalities, but it relates to socialist doctrine. That is, you create an État-providence after the Second World War, which is a massive social achievement. But by the 1970s, it becomes increasingly expensive. People take for granted its benefits and increasingly resent its costs. And it doesn't reduce inequality. So there's some sense in which the great achievement of post-war French social democracy is the creation of an État-providence, which in some sense begins to consume its legitimacy and therefore the electoral base that supports it. You haven't had a balanced budget since Giscard. It's not just right or left, it's tous les partis politiques confondus didn't maintain basic social fiscal discipline, so you paid yourselves more than you earned. The particular issue for French socialism and for all social democratic parties in Europe and in North America is that you wanted to reduce social inequalities in the labor market by supporting the rights of the organized public sector and public sector unions. And that was a noble social goal that goes back to Jaurès and goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. But it's had a perverse effect in the last 30 years, which is that you have organized public sector unions who have privileged pensions, privileged entitlements, early retirement, and that divides the labor market and makes it more difficult for young people and immigrants to get in. And yet you political parties associated with public sector unions then get punished by the electorate, resentful at the privileges extracted by the public sector and some private sector unions. And so labor market reform, of which you spoke, requires you to go head-to-head with important syndicalist interests who are actually consuming the legitimacy of the French left and exacerbating inequality. And then you've got, just to go on, you've got a heritage of state intervention in the economy, a state capitalism, which again started with very noble intentions, that it was, you don't like capitalisme sauvage, nobody likes capitalisme sauvage, so your solution is state capitalism, which turns out to be inefficient and burdens the public sector, and also acts to export moral hazard to the taxpayer. That is, if they make bad debts, it's the public that has to pay them off. You put all that together, and when the crisis hits, you've got problems that aren't merely difficult to solve, but that addressing them requires you to turn back on your own dogma and requires you to take off after interests that are the basis of your political support. Finally, to bring in the European dimension, you make European promises to keep your deficit at 3%, and you never meet them. Neither the Germans, neither does anybody else. But then when you have the bottom falling out of the euro because the Greeks don't play by the rules, the Greeks turn around and say to you, the French don't play by the rules. So why the hell should we play by the rules? So all of this comes together in 2008, all of this. And it's not just a crisis for France. It's a crisis for the political doctrine that you have represented in a very distinguished way all your life. And this is not said, just so be clear, by a right-wing nut or someone who's hostile to France. I love France. I'd rather be sick in France than in any other country in the world. I definitely would rather eat in France than anywhere else. I love this country, and I actually like its social model. But there is some sense in which the crisis laid bare the fiscal unsustainability of what you're trying to do and the bankruptcy of the socialist ideal. I'm saying this to challenge, so we get very frank, and so we talk about stuff, and I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael, and I'm sure Jean-Marc Ayrault will be delighted to address
Ignatieff, pour
this challenge.
votre franchise et votre humour. Et en même temps, peut-être que je vois dans vos propos une certaine contradiction. Puisque d'un côté, vous trouvez le modèle social français formidable, que vous préfériez vivre en France, puis en même temps, vous dites que vous avez tort de le défendre. Alors je suis face à un dilemme considérable.
This is very interesting that I perceive a contradiction is what you said, because you said you love to eat in France, to be sick if you have to be sick in France, and so on. You love France, but you criticize the French social model. So for me, it's a contradiction.
Yeah, but it's not, with respect, it's not my contradiction, it's yours.
Donc nous avons la même contradiction. Et c'est tout l'art de la politique, de trouver les solutions.
So we both have the same contradiction, and the art of politics is to find solutions.
Il y a deux aspects dans mon propos. Il y a la situation française, j'en ai parlé, mais brièvement. Non, la France est engagée dans un programme de réformes profondes qui ne sont pas la répétition de ce qui a été fait pendant si longtemps, puisque si l'opinion publique, je dirais, les électeurs socialistes ont tendance à être déçus, c'est parce que nous avons pris des décisions courageuses. Donc je les assume.
France has embarked on a very serious program of reform, and we're not turning our back to our values, but we have been penalized by the French electorate, and there are problems to be solved, but I assume responsibility for that, and we have to keep working toward that goal.
Et pour faire avancer ces réformes, moi je crois à une méthode, et vous avez parlé des syndicats, je crois à une méthode qui est, c'est pour ça que je suis un social-démocrate, qui est le dialogue social et la négociation sociale.
To promote these reforms, and you mentioned unions, I must tell you that as a social democrat, I believe in dialogue. I believe in dialogue with the workers and the unions.
Mais il y a en France plusieurs courants syndicaux qui ne sont pas tous d'accord.
But in France, there are a number of different unions, and some of them do not agree with.
Et l'accord qui a été signé par les syndicats sur la réforme du marché du travail, qui a ensuite été traduit dans la loi, n'a pas été signé par tous les syndicats. Seulement une majorité de syndicats qu'on appelle réformistes et qui ont considéré que c'était un bon compromis que de créer un nouveau cadre de négociation sur la durée du travail, sur les salaires, pour tenir compte aussi des problèmes de compétitivité des entreprises. Ces réformes viennent d'être mises en place et elles vont peu à peu produire les effets. Mais c'est du temps qu'il faut. Mais c'est un vrai changement culturel, je tenais quand même à vous le dire.
The agreement about the labor market was concluded with some of the unions, but not all the unions. We got the reformist unions on board, but some more extremist unions did not agree. And the law is based on this agreement we had with the reformist unions. So there's still a lot more to do, and we're going to work on it. But it's a real serious effort at reform.
Alors il y a le deuxième aspect qui est important et qui n'est pas qu'un problème franco-français, qui est les choix de politique économique de l'Europe et en particulier de la zone euro. Cette question, elle est posée.
The second issue,
elle est incontournable.
The second issue, and we have to address it, there's no other way, is the choice of economic policy. And this has to be not only at the French government level, but at the European level. So we have to find a solution.
Contrairement à ce que vous avez dit, les partis populistes, et c'est toujours la même méthode, les partis populistes et nationalistes jouent sur la question sociale pour attirer des électeurs. Et qui est le meilleur défenseur de l'État-providence aujourd'hui en France? C'est le parti du Front National, c'est le parti d'extrême droite.
The nationalist or populist or xenophobe parties you mentioned are quick to use the weakness of the situation, and they claim they are going to defend the interest of the poor and people who count on the state, on the government to receive.
Et leur argument essentiel pour dire que cet État-providence ou cette solidarité est en péril, la principale cause, c'est l'Europe. Ces partis-là n'ont qu'un thème, tous, dans tous les pays, et pas seulement en France, ailleurs, y compris en Allemagne, même si le nom était différent, c'est l'Europe et l'euro. Et donc, c'est pour ça que j'ai insisté au début de mon propos sur la nécessité historique de prendre des décisions maintenant pour sauver cette construction politique qu'est l'Europe, qui est indispensable au peuple européen. Mais c'est là qu'est la question, et c'est la question la plus difficile.
The populist party claim to defend the social model of France and to fight efforts to go back on it, and they blame Europe, all of them, whether it's in France or Germany or other countries. That's what they say. Europe is responsible for the risk and the Eurozone. And so they want to fight Europe. But what we have to do is to act fast, to preempt their policies or their proposals, and we have to change something at the European level.